everyone, my name is Evan Turk, and I am the illustrator of The People's Painter, How Ben Shahn Fought for Justice with Art. Sometimes when you're working on a project about another artist, there's kind of a pressure to, figure out how to approximate their art or to convey what their art is to an audience that might not be familiar. And I think for me, in this book, it was really a fun process because there's already a lot of Ben Shahn in my artwork. And it was kind of also similar to the process that Ben was going through in the book, where you're looking at these artists that you admire and figuring out what aspects of what they're doing works for the kind of stories that you want to tell. And for me, it was really exciting to be able to do that for a story about an artist that I admire and really focus in on those aspects of his art that I find so exciting. This is called a dummy, and a lot of illustrators use them to plan out how the book is actually going to feel when you're turning a page. It starts off with Ben as a child, and his drawings kind of always have a childlike feeling to them. So I really wanted the book to start off like this, with just Ben's hands as a child just sort of doodling. And I kind of liked the idea that this was almost him illustrating his own story. So you can see how each page connects to the next one. And you really get the idea of those page turns as you're going through. This was one of my favorite spreads as well, where Ben here is helping his mother and his siblings pack to go to New York, but his grandfather can't bring himself to make the journey. He talked about how as the train was pulling away, he was holding on to his grandfather's hand, which is such a poignant thing to hear, but also something that I think really conveys that feeling of having to leave everything you know and go somewhere new. This page, which you can actually see behind me, turned from 2 images into 3 in the final illustration. And this is actually also one of my favorite scenes in the book. And it's actually one that didn't originally exist because there's no text on this page, so it wasn't in the original manuscript. But I liked the idea of having that moment where Ben arrives in New York and is reunited with his father. I wanted that to be like a really pivotal moment in the book. Here is kind of this down shot of his family arriving at Ellis Island. So you can see how he and his mother kind of stand out amongst this huge crowd. And reading and listening to all of the oral history reports of Ellis Island, it's just kind of this insane process where there's so many people crammed into this one space, and everyone there is hoping for kind of this American dream. And the first thing that they get is crammed into this space where they're tested and prodded and asked all these questions in different languages. And so I thought it was kind of interesting to have that be kind of this moment where it's not maybe what they were hoping once they get there, but as soon as they're reunited with Ben's father, all of that journey becomes worth it, and all of the change that they're about to deal with becomes worth it once they're together again. So this was kind of one of my favorite spreads to work on as well, just having that kind of wordless pivotal moment in his life and that transition into the new life that he was going to have in New York. One of the things that I really love about Ben Shahn's artwork is his willingness to distort shapes to tell a story. So his work isn't usually about realism. It's not about capturing something perfectly exactly the way we see it with our eyes, but it's a way of abstracting things and pushing the shapes into more symbolic forms that help tell the story. So this illustration here is depicting when Ben's father was actually arrested for speaking out against the government in Lithuania. One of the things that I wanted to do in this spread was to really distort things in a similar way to the way that Ben Shahn does in his work, to really give that feeling of unease. So the way that the composition is really distorted. You see this window kind of open to that cold winter air. It really is kind of a fisheye lens almost, giving you a really strange perspective. But then the bodies of Ben's mother, Ben, and his younger siblings are all kind of distorted and abstracted into this one shape. So you can really see this single unit of their family and kind of how they're clutching tightly together. And I like that you can use abstraction and distortion to kind of make that more of an emotional point in the book. And then you have this unit and then the separation of the father, which then comes back in this illustration, when they're reunited and you have that same solid unit. So maybe this doesn't look realistically how people's bodies and arms would overlap when they're hugging, but because symbolically it relates back to that feeling when they were separated, now you get that feeling of closeness and togetherness. And that's something that Ben Shahn does a lot in his work, is where he's exaggerating things to make a storytelling point. And so that's one of my favorite aspects of his style. Another aspect of Ben Shahn's art that I really loved learning more about in the book, as well as in my research, was how much he related to the idea of letter forms and the written word. And I think part of that really came out of him originally learning Hebrew. You can see that here when he's back doodling in the margins of his Jewish religious texts that he had back at his home in Lithuania. So he started with one written language, and then when he came to New York, he worked with a lithographer, which is someone who would make signs and prints, and so he dealt with typography and the English alphabet. These two different languages influenced the shapes that he used and the ways that he composed his pictures. And so I really wanted that to be a part of the illustrations as well. You can see some of the typography that Ben Shahn did here and how that relates to the type on the cover, but also kind of the shapes that he used. Hebrew typography kind of figures into the way that the pictures are composed when he's back in Lithuania and they would have been speaking Hebrew, or I guess Yiddish at this point. These are some early sketches that I did, but how maybe even the character shapes could be related to the letter forms that he was learning about. So these are some early sketches of his father and his grandfather wood carving. I really wanted the shapes of all those different languages that really influence his work to influence the book as well. This is the scene where he's just gotten reunited with his father at Ellis Island, and now they're moving into Brooklyn. This was a difficult scene to compose because the text talks about so many different things that Ben is getting used to at this point. So it talks about the above ground trains, it talks about all the different signs everywhere, the crowds. It talks about him trying a tomato for the first time, which he was not a fan of. It talks about him falling over in a rocking chair because he had never seen a rocking chair before. So there's all these different aspects and kind of that overwhelming feeling of being an immigrant and being in a new place and all these different things that he had to learn and figure out all at once. And so this was probably the most challenging piece to compose. I did it in this way, kind of as a montage, where all these different scenes are connected. One, because that's a device that Ben Shahn uses a lot in some of his larger murals. He'll kind of connect all of these different scenes together. And in this one, I wanted also to have it feel very distinct from all of the scenes in Lithuania. Here, a lot of the shapes of the train tracks and things like that are based off of English letter forms. So these are kind of related to the shape of almost a T or an L, as opposed to the spreads in the shtetl, which had more of that feeling of the Hebrew writing. And so it has this very distinct, all these straight lines that you don't find a lot of in Hebrew. And so I use those kind of shapes to really compose all these different pieces together. So one thing that I really wanted to include in the book was the symbol of the dove. A lot of Ben Shahn's later work particularly dealt a lot with social justice and peace, and he used the symbol of the dove quite a bit. Reading the biography that Cynthia had written, that's kind of the progression where his work becomes more and more socially conscious. So I kind of wanted to show the transformation of his work into that symbol of peace. And so I really liked the idea of ending on this really hopeful note. And you can see that here, this is an older Ben Shahn with his granddaughter teaching her how to draw, and she's drawing a little dove as well. The Hebrew behind them means from generation to generation. That was a suggestion from Cynthia, and I love that, and kind of ending on the idea that the art that you make and the things that are important to you get passed on from generation to generation, and that idea of hope can also be passed on in that way. So I loved ending the book on that personal note for both Cynthia and for myself. I really hope that when kids are reading this book, one, I'm sure a lot of them will be introduced to Ben Shahn for the first time, which I think is amazing because he has such an accessible way of making art. So his art has a lot of complex and sometimes heavy ideas in them, but it's always done in a way where the goal is to communicate. And I think that kids will really respond to his art the more that they see of it. So that's one thing that I'm so excited about, is that this book is going to be able to introduce a whole new generation to Ben Shahn's artwork. And I hope that not only introducing them to him, but I really hope that kids will take away a little bit more about the process of becoming an artist and how it's not just a magic wand, where it's a process of trying things and learning new things and figuring out who you are as a person that really makes your art unique and makes it a unique contribution that you can give to the world. So I hope that there will be kids that are inspired not just by Ben Shahn's artwork, but about the process of being an artist and the excitement that that can give you as a lifelong path.